Garden of Eden. Even those who don't believe the Bible is true are familiar with the term. To them, it's a place symbolic of paradise, of perfection, of unspoiled goodness. But what do we really know about the world of Adam and Eve? What do we really know about Eden? Where was it located? What was it like there? Was it a blissful, almost supernatural paradise of flawless perfection, or a bountiful home for the first humans? And what is its connection to and meaning for the world we live in today? Well, while we don't know everything about the world of Adam and Eve, we do know some things. For example, there are 4 rivers associated with Eden in Genesis 2. And of the 4, we are at least certain about the identity of the 2 rivers the Bible describes in greater detail. These rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, actually still flow through modern-day Iraq. But the Bible also mentions 2 other rivers, the Pishon and the Gihon, and these rivers have never been successfully located, even though the Bible describes them in some detail. But this is how the Bible works. We know some details about Eden and what life was like there, but we don't know everything. But we do know that God reveals exactly what we need to know. The name Eden can be translated in a lot of different ways. When scholars first began looking at other Near Eastern languages, like Akkadian and Sumerian, they linked the name Eden with a similar word in these dialects. In those languages, the word means plain or slope. Now that makes a lot of sense if you think Eden was located in Mesopotamia. This is the ancient land that was located between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. But more recently, scholars have started to look at other languages in addition to these. For example, a more Aramaic interpretation of the name Eden doesn't mean plain or slope. It means something close to a garden of abundance. In Hebrew, the language of the Old Testament, the word Eden literally means luxury or delight. In the Septuagint, the first Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the word Eden is translated, in fact, as garden of luxuries. Now that's certainly a lot more vivid than plain or slope, and it points a little less to the exact location of Eden and a little more to what life there was actually like. In the Bible, it seems like Eden refers to more than just the garden in which God first placed man and woman. Genesis chapter 2, verse 8 speaks of the Lord planting a garden in Eden in the east. So the garden was just one part of an entire region. Next, the text describes a river flowing from Eden to water the garden in verse 10. Then finally, we see that the Lord took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden in verse 15. So let's boil it all down to say this. It seems that Eden was a region, and in that region, there was a well-watered garden. And this garden was luxurious for the first human beings. That image would actually have made really good sense to ancient readers of the text because kings in the ancient Near East would have parks and gardens irrigated by springs outside of the city that were in the middle of their capitals. So let's put all those things together, and when you put it all together, we see that the Bible intends for us to imagine, when we think about Eden, a sacred spot featuring a spring with an adjoining well-watered park. And that park is stocked with all kinds of trees and animals. So now at least we have a picture in our mind of the world of Adam and Eve. So let's turn back to the location. Where was the Garden of Eden located? Well, scholars and archaeologists have tried for centuries to answer that very question. The most obvious clues we have are the mention of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And if we use that as a guideline, there are several different spots where the garden might have been. These 2 rivers begin in the Armenian mountains, and from there they flow through Mesopotamia all the way down into the Persian Gulf. So based on that knowledge, there are many people who put the original location of the garden somewhere in the Armenian mountains near the source of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. But, of course, not everyone agrees. Other scholars think that the location was closer down to the Gulf, down in southern Mesopotamia. It's hard to know for sure because although we know where the Tigris and Euphrates are, we don't know about the other two rivers mentioned in Scripture. These rivers, again, the Pishon and the Gihon, maybe these were other rivers up in the mountains, but then again, these rivers might have been in the Zagros Mountains, or even could have been some of the irrigation canals of the southern Mesopotamian plains. We do have another location clue, though. We know from Genesis chapter 2 that the river Gihon flowed through all the land of Cush. This is in verse 13. Now, Cush was a region traditionally associated with Egypt, and if that's the case, then it would mean that Eden was located in the area from Egypt to Mesopotamia. And if that's the case, then the Pishon and the Gihon would be the white and blue Niles of Africa. Confused yet? Well, you're not alone if you are, but consider this. Perhaps there's actually a reason the Bible doesn't give us the exact location of Eden or the garden. The Bible doesn't intend to give us a map, but rather to communicate something else to us about the significance of Eden. So let's just say for a second that the Pishon and the Gihon rivers are in Africa. That would mean that Eden was within the boundary of the land God would promise to Abram in Genesis chapter 12. So why does that matter? Well, when you start looking back at the text, you get a few details that are sometimes overlooked. For example, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 uses the Hebrew word eretz. It's a word that's normally translated as land. This is the same word used in reference to the land promised to Abraham and his descendants. So, if you were an Israelite reading the book of Genesis and you saw this word popping up in both of these places, then both Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 12 are communicating something about God and his plan, namely, that God gave his people the gift of a good land as their home. But here's the thing. There's something about the world of Adam and Eve that is even more important than the topography and more important than the exact location. And that's the simple fact that in the Garden of Eden, God was present. And he was present there in a way we do not yet experience him. If you fast forward to Genesis chapter 3, you see that one of the first effects of sin was for Adam and Eve to try and hide from the presence of their Creator. See, the tragedy of sin is that the man and woman hid from the presence of God, but not before then. In Eden, prior to the fall, Adam and Eve walked and talked with God. They experienced him freely because God met with them there. So, what was life like in that context? What was the world like for Adam and Eve? Let's look again at the language. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, God gave Adam his job description, and he used two words to do so. In Hebrew, these two words are abad and shamar, and they are typically translated as tilling and keeping the land. They seem to be farming or gardening terms, and yet these two words, when they appear in the rest of the Old Testament, are translated differently. In the rest of the Old Testament, they refer to human service to God. They are translated less like farming terms and more like the words worship and obey. In other words, the core responsibility of Adam and Eve, indeed, the thing that they spent their time doing, even as they were physically tilling and caring for the garden, was worship and obedience. That's what life was like. And in many ways, not much has changed. Now, of course, we aren't living in a well-watered garden full of lush vegetation and varied animals, but we do live in a world created by God and sustained by his presence. And just as it was for Adam and Eve in Eden, the call on our lives is the same. Worship remains the truest and most real experience we can hope for, even as we are doing our own versions of tilling and keeping. The world of Adam and Eve reminds us, despite our lingering questions about it, that God not only has a plan, but a place for his people, and that in his plan and his place, he has and will continue to provide everything we need. God is still caring for creation, and He is bringing us back to a place someday in which we can experience unbroken fellowship with Him.